Hey, aren't you that PBM?
Middleman. At your service, doctor.
Don't you get rebates that save money on medicines?
Oh, PBMs like me get big rebates.
So why do patients tell me they're worried about their costs?
No one says we have to share the savings with patients.
Congress should make sure medicine savings go directly to patients, not middlemen. Visit phrma.org/middlemen to learn more. Paid for by pharma.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBTQ podcast. I'm Bryan Lauder, an editor at Slate, and I have recently been appointed by the administration of myself to be the undersecretary of filling my pockets with rocks and walking into the sea.
Oh, do that, Bryan. No, take those
We're
rocks
not confirming that.
Okay, I'll take the rocks out.
Just splash around for a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I'm Christina Cauterucci. I'm a writer at Slate, and I haven't been appointed as anything yet. I don't think I'm going to be. But, man, what a weird couple weeks this has been. It is a balm to see y'all's faces in, hashtag these trying times.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here in this podcast, sad to be here in this world.
Well, I'm Jules Peterson, feeling very happy to see you both. You haven't been appointed to anything, maybe disappointed, but, let's be real. It's been a long stretch of years where I felt that way in my life. I'm so happy to see you both, excited to dive in and keep things as gay as we can.
That's right. As listeners, as you can probably tell, this is our first time recording all together since the presidential election. And we wanted to do a little bit of group processing, not about the result per se. I think we all know how we feel about that. It was very bad. But another set of outcomes having to do with, let's say, trans political representation. I think both in the literal sense of a trans representative, but also in how trans people are being discussed in election postmortems. Is that right, Christina?
Yeah, definitely. So this election day brought us a new milestone in American history. I'm not talking about RFK Jr., who will probably be the first man with a worm in his brain and a rotting bear carcass in his trunk to serve as Secretary of HHS. I'm talking about Sarah McBride, who, when she's sworn in January, will be the first openly transgender member of Congress. You might have actually heard of McBride before, and not just because of Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who's been all over the news since the election, trying to ban McBride and other trans women from women's restrooms in the Capitol. But McBride has actually been a public figure for some time. For the past few years, she's served in the Delaware State Senate. Before that, she spoke at the DNC in 2016. She was the first openly trans person to do that. Before that, she was the first trans White House intern under Obama. Now she's taking Delaware's only seat in Congress. It's a big moment for trans representation in politics, absolutely. And there's a lot to be said about this Capitol bathroom ban, which McBride has said she'll comply with, to the great disappointment of many queer and trans people. But what we want to talk about today is the seemingly incongruous, but actually pretty closely connected fact that McBride's election came at the end of the most anti-trans election cycle the country has ever seen. There were an unprecedented number of anti-trans ads used to boost Republicans and attack Democrats up and down the ballot. It was a well-funded, concerted effort by conservative candidates and PACs to use trans people, especially trans kids, as a wedge issue to get the power they need to implement this broader repressive agenda. So today we want to talk about this seemingly dissonant but maybe altogether predictable moment in trans politics where we have this one kind of sign of progress that's matched by really troubling signs from both the increasingly extreme right wing and from supposed allies. We're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to dive right in. After a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. But with ZBiotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. ZBiotic is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/outward to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Outward at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/outward and use the code OUTWARD at checkout for 15% off.
Hey, aren't you that PBM?
Middleman, at your service, doctor.
Don't you get rebates that save money on medicines?
Oh, PBMs like me get big rebates.
So why do patients tell me they're worried about their costs?
No one says we have to share the savings with patients.
Congress should make sure medicine savings go directly to patients, not middlemen. Visit phrma.org/middlemen to learn more. Paid for by pharma.
Feel your max with Brooks Running and the all-new Ghost Max 2. They're the shoes you deserve, designed to streamline your stride and help protect your body. Treat yourself to feel-good landings on an ultra-high stack of super comfy nitrogen-infused cushion that takes the edge off every step, every day. The Brooks Ghost Max 2. You know, technically, they're a form of self-care. Brooks, let's run there. Head to brooksrunning.com to learn more.
And we're back. Just to get us started, I want to open things up to both of you. How have you been processing the Sarah McBride moment alongside the sort of general anti-trans thrust of this entire election cycle?
Yeah, it's sort of like interesting revelation about her having taken money from AIPAC. I think I sort of think about it in a broader context, right? It seems to be that like the discourse of electoral first as like a measure of something is just kind of like, mostly PR for political parties, and it's just like not been very interesting for a long time. I think in other ways, there are just kind of like genuine boring questions that really have nothing to do with Sarah McBride. It could have been like anyone in particular, like being elected as the first trans person, federally into the Congress, right? Like, well, what does it mean that that's happening at the same moment that, anti-trans politics actually have a certain currency that they've never had before? And that, I think, is sort of like a more worthwhile question. But, it clearly has something to do with the hollowness of the idea of someone being the first. That, in fact, it turns out this first elected representative is really not one that it seems like many trans people are going to get excited about, given some of her policy positions and the way that, she's sort of aligned with the party establishment. And so, it's sort of it's kind of just like an interesting kind of check-in moment. I have like a very ridiculous little side swipe to take, though, at media coverage, which is like, I know it's this like this old convention that started with gay people to be like, this is the first openly.
Yeah.
When they're like, the first openly trans person, like, bitch, you think any closeted trans people been serving in Congress? You think any trans women been passing stealth in the Congress of the United States?
I actually kind of love that. Like, it's such a like journalistic tick to be like, well, we technically can't say that like, someone serving in Congress in the early 1800s wasn't trans. Like, perhaps they were, and they didn't have the language to describe it, or like, we don't know what all these people were doing at home.
Yeah, right.
I actually do kind of love that, because it's like it's saying that like, yeah, possibly trans people are in more places than you would have expected. And what you were saying though about her like being sort of solidly establishment, I mean, to me that's certainly, it's no surprise on any level, in part because she is who she is, and she has been this person since, I think I interviewed her when she first came out as trans as student body president at American University in like 2012 or something. And she already was so incredibly polished and on message. Like, I could not believe, I've interviewed a lot of college students and I've never interviewed somebody like her. And I also think 2B, you know, I agree that firsts feel so stupid at this point. I think there was a point in my life where it felt like they mattered. And with every new first, it's felt like stupider and stupider because it really doesn't mean anything other than that, you know, it makes people feel good about themselves. But I think to be a trans person who has been the first of so many things, like first trans person to speak at the DNC, the first trans intern in the White House under Obama. I think she's had to be like that. And I'm not suggesting that she's disingenuous, but I think a trans person who was more radical in any sense just simply would not have achieved what she's achieved. And so, yeah, I think it probably does feel like on its face exciting for some people, but also the policies she's talking about, like the thing that she really ran her campaign on was what she's helped do in the Delaware State Senate, like raising the minimum wage, securing paid family and medical leave, investing in Medicaid. Like, these are actually things that will affect trans people's lives a lot more than like having a trans face in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, I was sort of interested in that too, Christina, that, you know, in terms of comparing her success with this larger anti-trans movement that we're going to talk about, it seems like they're not, I mean, they're connected insofar as she is trans, but like the campaign she ran in Delaware is very specific to that state. And it was kind of a campaign that I think now in all of these, you know, election postmortems that we're hearing about what the Harris campaign did wrong, it's kind of like she ran the campaign that maybe a lot of people would have liked to have seen in terms of those sort of kitchen table economic issues. And so her success there is like not so surprising. It is still, you know, notable, but being trans, I'm not sure had much to do with the success, you know, of that campaign. And so comparing the two, there is like a dissonance or maybe even like a disconnect between the two things in my mind. It's something to celebrate, I guess, but it's also like her case is so specific to where she, you know, is now representative for that it's hard to compare.
Yeah. And on the other hand, though, I feel like it's related in some sense in that this anti-trans backlash we're seeing is directly related to the rising, you know, cultural visibility, political representation, like seeming political power, although like really I don't feel like trans people have a lot of political power, but like the right clearly believes that they do. It's a reaction to that. And so I think the like Sarah McBride's ascension has sort of tracked along with a broader increase in trans visibility. And I think that is related to why this is the election that Republicans realized they could use trans people as a wedge issue to try to, you know, stir up fear. And I mean, I think it's very telling that neither Sarah McBride nor Kamala Harris nor any other Democrat running talked about trans people in their campaigns. There was also no trans person who spoke at the DNC this year, which, you know, Sarah McBride spoke in 2016. So there's clearly a turn away from talking openly about trans issues, even among candidates who, you know, do support trans rights in various ways behind the scenes. But even so, you know, that didn't stop Republicans from making it a hallmark of their campaign. And so this is what we have to deal with going forward is how are people on the left going to change in response to this election cycle, knowing that no matter what they say, Republicans are constantly going to use this issue as, you know, one of their main talking points.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of part of the whole problem, right? It's like, it really strikes me like a part of what we're talking about is a sort of, you know, party establishment and the sort of like liberal establishments, like, you know, basically just being asleep at the wheel for a long time because its interests are the interests of the status quo. And frankly, they've just never actually been in any meaningful way pro-trans, right? There's just been a kind of cheap representational and basically kind of a corporate diversity logic, right? You recruit the semblance of a kind of diverse coalition that is actually really truly just superficial because that sort of enhances the representational brand of that party or that establishment. And I think, like, I don't know, one of the pieces about this election that I've actually really enjoyed the most comes from fellow historian Gabriel Wynant, who wrote in Dissent magazine a really, I think, fabulous breakdown from a kind of political economic perspective of why this election went the way it did. But one of the points that he made in passing that I thought was really profound, and I want to bug him to say more about it at some point, is he's like, part of the reason, right, that the MAGA movement, or even just Trump as a political avatar, have achieved so much success is, first of all, like, they are opposing themselves to the political economic order, right? Like, Trump has been a huge critic of certain core tenets of neoliberal economic policy, mainly around free trade and globalization, right? And that's why, he, ripped up the NAFTA agreement, and, tariffs, he prefers tariffs, right? A kind of economic nationalism. This is a huge shift away from, basically economic policy since the 70s or 80s. And in that sense, although a lot of what it's created is really odious, the MAGA movement has actually been, like, quite politically creative, right? This is one of the things Moynihan talks about. And he had a kind of list of things that they had invented. And one of them was, like, anti-trans politics. And it kind of made something click for me, right? It's like, I'm a historian. I've been looking into this. Like, there were not anti-trans politics in the past. It's because, like, there aren't many trans people. No one cared about them. They're not that, like, no one would ever waste their time trying to build political clout on attacking trans people. There are a lot less trans people than gay and lesbians. So it's just like, it didn't work that way. Anti-trans politics that we're facing, like, they're just being created in real time right now. And that is something that the right has created, right? And basically the liberal establishment, or like the Democratic Party standing in for that in the US, is defending a status quo. It has no playbook to say about that, because it's never actually been like a pro-trans political movement, because trans people were just completely ignored until very, very recently. And so I think part of what's sort of shaping up right now is, like, actually only one side of the political spectrum cares about trans people, and in a pretty disturbing way. But I think what's really interesting to me is the intense resistance in the center left to really, like, think about what trans people's political interests might be beyond representation, right? And I think that kind of links back to what you were saying earlier, right, about, in part, the way McBride's run her campaign. I'm sure part of the kind of, like, I'm not here to be a trans politician, I'm here for Delawareans, is just like a truism of local politics. It's also a defense mechanism, right? Because, if she were seen to be a sort of, like, avatar for trans politics, it would probably be terrible for her career. But also, like, she just genuinely isn't, because that's, like, the party has no politics for trans people other than kind of representation. And so I think there are just sort of bigger questions that I know I've really been thinking about a lot in the last 5 years about, like, what is the purpose of anti-trans politics if this is a new thing? What is its relationship to economic crisis? And in that sense, to me, it does seem like a capsule for understanding something about this election. And I have to say, I really disagree with takes that sort of imagine that people are motivated to vote, like, by anti-trans messaging because they, like, ideologically hate trans people, or they, like, love gender or sexuality. Like, that's not, people don't do that, right? Like, people don't do things because they're like, I so believe that women have to have vaginas. It's not how human beings think and behave, except, like, a very small, bizarre, like, grifter class who take up too much space online. Like, people are motivated very clearly from all the exit poll data by the economy, by the just absolute devastation of standards of living and wealth inequality, that have been accelerated since 2020 in a lot of the ways that, the last 4 years, the Biden administration, has, like, taken away a lot of, benefits and redistributive programs that were put in place at the start of the pandemic. And it's like, in that sense, like, to me, it just seems that being anti-trans is kind of like a symptom, right? It's not the cause of, like, the political system we live in or the politics we're experiencing. It's like a really useful organizing rubric for the right. And I think part of what is so frustrating is, like, my understanding of trans politics is just left-wing material redistribution, which is what trans people need, because most trans people are in the working class. And most trans people, they experience downward mobility for trying to transition. And, like, that's actually what's happening. But there's, like, not even lip service paid to that, right? And so like basically you have one like element in the political spectrum just completely monopolizing the way that trans people are framed and talked about and putting it in just really bizarre terms. But then there's like, it's running up against literally nothing. And so now here we are, right? And it's like, I just feel like this is so frustrating to now, like people are very stressed and kind of flummoxed, but it's like, yeah, we've been needing to deal with this question for like quite a number of years, and just sort of conceding all of that territory, right? Conceding all of that in advance, I think sort of sets up this like bizarre situation where people are sort of like, what is going on? And now I don't know what to do.
All right, I think we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Rated E to T. You're listening to an ad for PC Game Pass. Want new games on day one like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle? How about living out your Sims life with EA Play? We're talking high-quality PC games all for one low monthly price. We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle available December 9th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. Okay, that's the ad. You can go back to doing whatever you were doing now.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
All right, we're back. I do feel like it's a hard moment for Democrats to know how to talk about trans issues, in part because they don't know how. Like, most of them probably don't know many trans people. They're not comfortable with it. Like, they're old. And the situation that they're in now is, and I'm curious what you would make of this, Jules, you know, there are actual policies that they've gone on record supporting that would materially affect trans people, like a lot of them having to do with trans kids and anti-discrimination laws and stuff like that, which I obviously think the Democratic Party should be the party to make that a part of its, you know, mission and agenda. And then you have Kamala Harris. So there was an ad that Trump ran that Kamala Harris's sort of main super PAC found that people who watched this ad, their support shifted about 3 percentage points toward Donald Trump. It was like one of Trump's most effective ads, and it showed clips of a conversation she had with Mara Kiesling of the National Center for Trans Equality in 2019, where she does this stupid thing that she does all the time, which is like, I'm Kamala Harris and I'm she, her. Like, you're one of the most recognizable public figures in the world. Actually, you don't need to say your pronouns. That's the kind of like stupid, like surface level representation stuff that actually feels offensive to me. But then she goes on to say, to actually respond to criticisms that she's received from the left, I think about the moment in California where she enforced this policy refusing gender affirming care to an incarcerated trans person. And, you know, she said this thing that they show in Trump's ad where she's like, trans incarcerated people should have access to gender affirming care. So it like, Jules, I want to know what you make of this sort of like feeling that I think Kamala Harris had in that moment of needing to show support for the trans community, probably in response to lobbying that she got from LGBTQ groups. But then, you know, obviously coming out with this campaign where she's like campaigning with Republicans, taking like hard lines on immigration and like other things that are obviously, as we've talked about, harmful to trans people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a great example of how like everything was set up to fail, right? Like those lobbying groups do a really terrible job. They're the same groups that like for a decade or more were just like, no, trans people, go away. We don't like you. We want to do marriage equality. Shh, be quiet. Right. And now we're like, we must stand up for trans people by raising awareness, which is like, baby, awareness is the thing that is ruining everything. But then you have like this kind of idea of like boutique, you know, Democratic Party politics where everything is just a series of like micro constituencies where you say the right word and you unlock the focus group. Right. And then it's like, I mean, it's just like, it's ridiculous. And it part of what it does, I think, is it fails to contend with what trans people's political demands might be, right? And I'm not implying that trans people are a unified group of people, but if, as I suggested earlier,
Right.
they tend to be working class because something about trying to transition tends to negatively affect, right, your life circumstances and particularly your income and your job prospects and interferes with your education long before any laws in any states tried to mandate that experience. Well, then it's like, you know, a lot of people be like, yeah, duh, of course you give people access to surgery in prison, but like, talk about problematic hills to die on. Stop fucking locking up trans. Like, guess who gets locked up disproportionately? Black and brown trans women. So heavily criminalized in this country is a primary vector of state violence that structures their entire life conditions. So it's like, yeah, it's better for them. Like, look, I know the history of trans women being denied healthcare while being incarcerated. It is some of the most horrifying stuff I've ever read that, like, I have to talk about in therapy. It's so awful. But like, just giving the healthcare is not the reformist position. No one was ever asking for that except these corporate, lobbying groups and national nonprofits that just have terrible political agendas, right? And then it's like, I think that's something that ties the Harris campaign back to the question of McBride, right? Like it was really interesting to basically watch the whole trans internet turn against her several days after the election, right? And one of the reasons why is that, like, again, as a working class group, right, trans people seem to be disproportionately pro-Palestine. So when they find out this revelation about her taking money from AIPAC, right, and being so, sort of conventionally pro-Israel in the Democratic Party sense. So like, well, that's the reason that I don't support her, right? Has nothing to do with her being trans, it's nothing to do with her sense of trans politics. It's like, guess what? Trans people have more political interests than just being trans. It's not really a political interest at all, right? And being represented or like being given a little, crumb at the table of American mass incarceration or like military empires. Like, yeah, turns out no one was asking for that. And then it's just like handing things on a platter to Republicans to like make of it what they will, right? I mean, it just seems like I couldn't imagine a better recipe for political disaster. But it's like these things take years to put in motion and then the chickens come home to roost. It's just like, great. So glad no one was ever asking for these things, right? Like, people have, I don't know. I just continue to think that's part of the riddle of the emergence of anti-trans politics is it's also really, I think it's really distorted our idea of what trans politics are. And I've probably said this on the show before. I'm just not a fan of trans politics. We don't need like trans-specific politics, right? I think trans people are part of, a multiracial working class who have bigger demands than just like include me, recognize me, know my pronouns. Those are not real material changes that help people. Those are bougie political demands that kind of distract from the things that people need. And I think the most telling example for me still remains trans youth. Like, I really genuinely think most people, if you really ask them, most adults, they're not comfortable with trans kids transitioning. They actually don't believe in it. I actually think most gay people don't believe in it. I actually think a lot of the people leading these organizations, I think a lot of the people in the movements who are forced in their jobs to defend trans kids don't actually really feel comfortable with it at the end of the day. And it shows, honey. And it's like, all right, we got to deal with that kind of stuff, right? Like, we got to think about how did we get into such a terrible position where it seems like this is some sort of a moral dilemma or philosophical question when it's really about like bread and butter issues about children's like survival and welfare, right? Like, I know how to have that conversation because I've been like in that space for a long time doing that work, but it just like, it's another great example to me where I feel like we've just been sort of like walking slowly into the abyss for years on end on autopilot instead of like listening to people from the trans left who are like, by the way, we already thought about this and have a different way to talk about it or think about it, right? And so now it's like, again, I think the kind of spectacular collapse of some of those political messages or projects is like really frustrating for everyone, but like, we've had a different way this whole time.
Yeah, there was something I just wanted to sort of add to that. What do people actually believe about trans youth, and how did that show up in this election? Something that was clarifying for me when I was researching this episode, something that Masha Gessen said about responding specifically to all of the like $215 million worth of anti-trans ads that the Trump campaign ran up until the election. I mean, this was one of their big closing arguments alongside immigration was really trans youth sports and the incarcerated folks, but really the trans inclusion on youth sports teams and bathroom access. Gessen said this is on a New York Times opinion podcast, this is a quote, "What Republicans are seeing and feeling is that people are anxious about the future. They're anxious about their economic future. They're anxious about their social future. And that can all be boiled down to this anxiety about one's children, that one's children are going to come home from school one day and speak a different language than the parents, or use a different name, or generally be a stranger. That fear of being alienated from your own children is at once fundamental and also a great stand-in for this generalized anxiety about the future." I think, this is Gessen speaking, I think that's something that Republicans understand super well that Democrats don't understand at all. I just thought that sort of ties in with what you were saying, Jules, about what do we actually like think and feel about trans youth. I thought that observation that Republicans have cynically, I think, in a lot of cases, like understood what you just said and deployed it here to some effect anyway. I don't know how effective those ads actually were in terms of driving votes, but that analysis from Gessen was sort of clarifying to me. I don't know what you guys think of it.
I don't know that I know any Democrats who have done a good job making an affirmative case for why it is important to, because I think you have to address these issues head on. If we've learned anything from the Briggs Initiative in 1978, where like the group in Miami that lost to Anita Bryant was all about like, oh, this is all about individual rights and not sort of addressing the main argument of the other side, which is that gay people are sexual predators that are a threat to your children. The people who won the Briggs Initiative, not only did they have this big coming out campaign and everything, but they were like, we're going to address this head on and remind people that most sexual predators are, straight men abusing their relatives. But it's hard for me to imagine any Democrat today making sort of like a confident and full-throated argument to be like, what are you guys even talking about? I think it can be done. Actually, I'm curious what you guys think about this, but the Kentucky governor, Andy Beshear, who's now was reelected in a red state, a Democrat, who vetoed a bill that would have been harmful to trans youth. His argument was like, I don't necessarily share this messaging, but like, these are God's children. Like, what are you talking about? Which I think was probably very effective in that state, or at least something where people are like, all right, I know where you're coming from, And I feel like there's a seed of something effective in that, where people can just be like, these are kids. And also maybe say like parents' rights, give a parent a right to support their child in whatever way that child needs. I don't know. Like, I'm just kind of spitballing here. But like, it does feel to me like they need to respond directly to what's going on instead of pretending like it's not happening.
Yeah. And what we've been seeing in the days, weeks since the election is sort of turning against, like sort of throwing trans people under the bus. Exactly. Or, sort of saying like, God, the best example or worst example of this that I've seen so far was from this liberal comedian that I followed on Instagram. He's Southern, Trey Crowder, for a long time, who I really have liked because he has an accent like the one that I grew up around, and he's talking about liberal policies. But he just a couple days ago had one of his little reels, I guess, where he said, we got to pick up the proletariat and drop the pronouns, right? Like, so like this is the way to win. We got to drop the pronouns, not abandoning our LGBT brothers and sisters, y'all, but like that Latinx stuff was stupid, and we got to like stop that. So it's so.
But also like the emphasis on pronouns is dumb, like it.
I don't think he was talking about what you're talking about, Christina. I think he was saying like any embrace of queer people or trans people as the front of like a democratic platform is the reason that we lost, right? And that's not what happened in this election, like at all. Like that we were not part of Harris's messaging or campaign in any way. We were absolutely sort of hidden behind it. And so it's been really disheartening to see that not surprising maybe, but like disheartening to see that shift. It's been really upsetting to see the quickness with which liberals have gone, and I've used that word specifically, not progressive or leftist, liberals have gone like anti-woke, like as if that was the problem rather than a lack of like a coherent vision from the Democratic campaign.
Yeah. Well, part of what Bashir is tapping into that I think is so rare is he has conviction.
Yes.
The man has some fucking passion about it, right? But I think that's actually really important. I wonder if this also helps explain the misstep of people like that comedian too, where they're like, okay, first of all, just empirically, you're making a distinction that doesn't make any sense. You want to talk about proletariat, honey? Let me tell you about trans women. Yeah. Okay? Let me tell you about how the kind of vision for free public health care that trans people are working towards is one that is very much about a renewed working class politics. But I think that's exactly it, right? One of the features of liberalism, because it's been the kind of, and now it's neoliberalism, but it's been the default hegemonic style of American governance since the 1930s. That's what a historian would say. The historian is. So part of what that means is it's become such a status quo, right? It's very technocratic. It's also incredibly condescending and elitist. And I think this is part of what is just really shows up in the contrasting emotional styles of the two parties right now, right? I don't agree with the Republicans, that I'm not a fan of fascist politics, but it appeals directly to the real felt sense of fear and insecurity, right? That the vast majority of people have feel because their actual living conditions have gotten worse, markedly worse in the last several decades, intensively worse in the last 4 years, never recovered in many cases since 2008, right? And so I think it's true, right? That then trans youth, for example, can be a potent symbol, right? That organizes and gives coherence to a disarray and a suffering and a misery, right? That otherwise is being unaddressed.
I mean, it's funny because something you just said is actually what Sarah McBride said on The View recently. But she was basically like, any therapist will tell you that the thing that like is so powerful for healing is people being like, I see your pain, I feel your pain. And really the party that did that in this election was the Republican Party. I guess a thought that I've been having is like, I think people who, were motivated by these anti-trans ads, which again, who knows how many of them it actually did move, might not care as much about that issue if they felt like other stuff was getting done and that their pain was being felt by the Democratic Party. Yeah. And that's the sort of Andy Bashir message too, is that, I can sort of forgive that other stuff because, it doesn't affect me that much, like whether someone else's kid transitions, but like, maybe I don't agree with it, but I can look past it.
If these other economic things are being taken, being taken.
Yeah, because like that's actually more important to me. Yeah. That will actually affect my life. Talking about whether, teenagers should be able to control their bodies. I mean, I wrote a piece this election cycle about the abortion ballot initiative in Florida, which, 57% of people voted to overturn the state's abortion ban, and it still didn't pass because it needed a 60% threshold. But anyway, one of the big talking points on the right in that campaign was this is going to remove the parental consent stipulation. Yeah. And this is something that, the requirement for parental consent for a young person to get an abortion is actually quite popular. A lot of people believe that should be law. But I wonder if there's room to like make it clear to people like how messed up it would be to force a child to carry a pregnancy and give birth. Like that's actually really, really disturbing when you think about it in that sense. And like I just feel like there's a lot of room for what I think they call narrative change around all of these things that is not conducive to like the quickness of an election cycle or the sort of like mercenary nature of it. But that feels like it requires a lot more deep thought and work that cannot be solved by like only listening to the queer and trans people who have like 4-year degrees and good jobs.
Right. Have that fight, right? Like be willing to have that fight. I think that's one of the observations that historians of fascism have made. You just cannot defeat it through like smart politics and good talking points and like electoral coalition. You have to confront this shit because it is visceral. It is in your face, right? But it is combatable. There are like so many important ways to be able to come at that stuff. And I just think, and I like what you said too, Christina. It's like, it also has to do with accepting that like electoral timelines are not like definitive and they're also not causal, right? And they're not the cause of what is happening. They're just symptoms. And I think that it's so important in this moment to like deal with the reality of that a lot of the stuff that's like coming home to roost right now again has been like building, and has not been building unopposed, but people have not been paying attention. But I think what you just said is so spot on, and I will go down defending this point to my last breath. I just think what like queer and trans or LGBT politics are like our college educated or graduate degree style, like very elite white politics. And it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people don't like them because like, why would they? They defend the interests of a tiny group of people that are actually antagonistic to the interests of the working class majority, including the queer and trans people who are in that majority and are the majority of queer and trans people. And I just think this is a great time to really like sit with that and think about that as we figure out like, yeah, what do you want to do about that? Or what do we want to do about that collectively?
Yeah, that's all the time we have for this discussion this week, but I know we're going to be talking about this for the next 4 years and beyond. Listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what exactly went down earlier this month. You can email us at any time at outwardpodcast@slate.com.
That is it for the main show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed. This week, we've got a round of Pride and Provocations for you. If you're not already a subscriber, remember that by joining Slate Plus, you get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on all our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the Outward Show page, or you can visit slate.com/outwardplus to get access wherever you listen. Other than that, please send us your feedback and topic ideas to outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show so others can find it. Until next time, stay gay, everybody. Say really gay, everybody. We need you to say like extra, extra gay right now.
Yeah, I agree. Bye, Bryan.
Bye.